What if I told you that $300,000 can be enough to never work again? I can see your eyebrows go up. It sounds small compared with the $1 million retirement fantasies you see online, but numbers don't lie, and neither does a plan built from first principles. Most people think you need millions to never work again. I'm here to tell you that's wrong. In fact, just $300,000, yes, $300,000 can be enough to give you complete freedom for the rest of your life. And I'll show you exactly how it works step by step, without any magic, without luck, just using simple math and strategy that anyone can understand. Most people grow up believing that financial freedom has a seven-figure price tag attached to it. They imagine they need $1 million, maybe two, maybe five, just to consider stepping away from traditional work. But that belief isn't built on mathematics or real strategy. It's built on fear, assumptions, and the lifestyle expectations that society has quietly programmed into us. The truth is far simpler and much more empowering. You don't need millions to stop working forever. With the right mindset, the right environment, and the right long-term approach, $300,000 can be enough to fund a life where work becomes optional instead of mandatory. The key is shifting from a consumption-driven lifestyle to a freedom-driven one. Most people spend based on what they earn. When income goes up, spending goes up. But when you step out of that loop and build a life around intentional choices rather than automatic habits, your cost of living often becomes much lower than you ever imagined. That low cost of living is what turns a modest investment portfolio into a freedom engine. $300,000 sitting in a conservative, well-structured investment strategy can realistically return around 4% per year after inflation. That's $12,000 annually. At first glance, $12,000 doesn't seem like much, especially to people who live in high-cost cities or maintain expensive lifestyles. But the equation changes when you intentionally design your life to run lean, efficient, and focused on what matters. If you relocate to an area with a lower cost of living or adopt a simplified lifestyle that eliminates unnecessary expenses, $12,000 a year can handle many essentials. Even more importantly, that modest return doesn't need to be your only source of income. Once your baseline needs are covered, even partially, you're no longer trapped by the urgency of a paycheck. Suddenly you can choose part-time work, freelance projects, or small passion-driven income streams that feel effortless instead of draining. Even a few hours a week doing something flexible can boost that $12,000 to $20,000, $30,000, or more. And at that point, you're no longer surviving, you're living freely. The real magic happens when you're not forced to withdraw the maximum every year. If you can allow the portfolio to grow while supplementing your lifestyle with small bursts of optional income, the compounding effect accelerates. That $300,000 becomes $320,000, then $350,000, then $400,000, quietly and consistently working in the background. Most people underestimate just how powerful a moderate return becomes when you no longer sabotage your own progress with a high-burn lifestyle. Time becomes your ally instead of your enemy. And when time is on your side, the amount needed to achieve freedom drops dramatically. People often confuse luxury with freedom. Luxury requires millions, freedom doesn't. Freedom requires that your basic needs are met without relying on a demanding job, a stressful environment, or a constant cycle of upgrading everything in your life. $300,000 is not a magic number by itself, but it represents a threshold where your investments can begin replacing a portion of your income. And once that portion is covered, you're closer to autonomy than most high-income earners who spend every dollar they make. This approach isn't about deprivation. It's about building a life where your expenses align with your values so that your wealth doesn't have to be enormous to support you. Once you break free from the mindset that you need millions, you start seeing the possibilities that were always there. $300,000 becomes not just a pile of money, but a launch pad for a lifestyle built around intention, freedom, and control over your own time. Most people spend their whole lives thinking wealth is about the number they see on a bank statement. They picture this mountain of money that needs to be built before they can finally relax, finally breathe, finally step away from work they don't enjoy. But that belief completely misses the real purpose of money. Wealth isn't about having some gigantic pile stacked higher than everyone else's. It's about what that money actually allows you to do. It's about the space it creates in your life, the pressure it removes, the choices it opens up, and the time it gives back to you. When you start seeing money not as the goal but as the tool, everything about your relationship with it changes. You stop obsessing over the size of the pile and start focusing on how to make that pile work for your life rather than against your peace. A surprising truth is that many people who earn huge incomes or accumulate big portfolios still don't feel free. They wake up stressed, they feel tied to jobs they don't enjoy, and they worry constantly about losing what they've built. That's because having a lot of money and having control over your time are two completely different things. One is external, measurable, and easily compared to others. The other is internal, deeply personal, and rooted in how intentionally you've designed your life. Someone with a moderate amount of money but extremely low financial pressure might actually be far freer than someone with millions who's terrified of losing their lifestyle or social status. So the question isn't, how much do I have? The real question is, does what I have buy me back my time? The moment you switch your mindset from piling up dollars to reclaiming hours, the whole game becomes simpler. $300,000, when used thoughtfully, can create more freedom than $3 million used carelessly. It depends on how you structure your expenses, where you choose to live, and how willing you are to resist the trap of consumption. Most people don't realize that the real expense holding them back isn't housing or food or transportation. It's the expectation that life needs to constantly expand. A bigger house, a newer car, more expensive vacations, more frequent upgrades. There's no amount of money that can outrun an ever-expanding lifestyle, but there is a very achievable amount that can easily support a stable one. When you remove the constant push for more, you begin to see how little is actually needed to live a fulfilling life. This is where money's real power shows itself. It's not powerful because of what you can buy with it. It's powerful because of what you no longer have to do because of it. You don't have to take a job you hate. You don't have to say yes to every opportunity out of fear. You don't have to live in survival mode or worry that a single unexpected bill will completely shake your life. With a solid financial foundation, your mind shifts out of panic and into creativity. You start thinking more clearly, taking smarter risks, and choosing work that interests you rather than work that drains you. Once your basic needs are covered by the returns from your investments, even if it's a modest amount, you gain this rare form of stability that most people never experience. Suddenly, you're not waking up thinking, how do I make money today? Instead, you wake up thinking, what do I want to do today? That shift alone is worth more than any amount of luxury purchases. Freedom of time is the ultimate currency, and money is simply the bridge to reach it. The irony is that people who chase large piles of money often never reach this sense of freedom because they link their self-worth to accumulation. They keep moving the goalpost. They convince themselves they need more, another 100,000, another million before they can relax. But the people who focus on controlling their time discover that they can reach freedom far sooner than society suggests. It's not the quantity of money, it's the relationship you have with it. If money is your master, you'll never feel wealthy no matter how much you have. If money becomes your servant, even a modest amount can give you a life most people only dream about. Wealth becomes real the moment it begins to protect your time instead of consuming it. When your investments cover your needs, when your lifestyle is shaped by intention rather than impulse, when your days are filled with choices instead of obligations, then you've reached a level of wealth that can't be measured by a net worth calculator. It's measured by calm mornings, flexible afternoons, and the absence of dread on Monday mornings. It's measured by the ability to say no without fear and yes without stress. It's measured by how fully your life belongs to you rather than to a paycheck. That is what money is truly for. And once you understand that, the number in your account stops being the headline and starts being the tool that quietly supports a life designed around freedom, purpose, and time you finally control. When most people hear that a simple 4% return on $300,000 can create the foundation for financial freedom, they immediately dismiss it. They think the number is too small, the returns too modest, the lifestyle too limited. But that reaction comes from a misunderstanding of how wealth is built and how freedom is structured. The real power isn't in chasing huge investment gains or trying to double your money overnight. The real power is in building a consistent, reliable system where your money quietly generates enough to support a lean, intentional lifestyle while still allowing the principal to grow. A 4% return isn't some wild guess or fantasy. It's an entirely realistic after-inflation return for a well-diversified, long-term portfolio that isn't seeking risk for the sake of excitement. It's slow, steady, predictable, and exactly the kind of return that gives you stability rather than stress. So take that $300,000 and imagine it sitting in an investment approach designed for resilience rather than adrenaline. Maybe that's a mix of index funds, maybe a combination of income-producing assets, maybe a strategy built around minimizing drawdowns. You're not trying to beat the market or outsmart the world. You're simply aiming to preserve your capital and let it work. A 4% real return on $300,000 gives you $12,000 a year. That number is where most people stop thinking. They compare it to their current lifestyle, their current expenses, their current environment, and they assume it's impossible. But financial freedom isn't about maintaining your present lifestyle. It's about creating a new one that aligns with your goals, your values, and your desire for autonomy. If you're willing to live intentionally, if you're willing to design your lifestyle rather than inherit it from the culture around you, $12,000 becomes a foundation rather than a limitation. Imagine living in a place where housing isn't crushingly expensive. Imagine not spending on things out of habit or pressure. Imagine crafting a life where the biggest expenses, rent, food, transportation, are optimized instead of bloated. That shift doesn't lower your quality of life. It raises it because it gives you back your time. And once your baseline is lowered, that $12,000 becomes incredibly powerful. It covers a good chunk of your essentials. It removes the fear that comes from having to earn every dollar you need. It creates breathing room. And breathing room is where freedom begins. But the real key isn't just the $12,000. It's the psychological transformation that happens when some portion of your life is already funded by your investments. You no longer feel trapped. You no longer feel desperate. You can choose part-time work, seasonal work, remote freelance work, low-stress projects, or passion-driven side income. Earning an extra $1,000 a month becomes a low-pressure task instead of a life-or-death pursuit. And that small additional income does something remarkable. It allows you to leave most of that 4% return untouched, letting your principal continue to grow instead of being drained. Now you're compounding. Now that $300,000 starts creeping upward, not downward. Maybe it becomes 310, then 320, then 350. And now the 4% return is generating 14,000, then 15,000, then 18,000. This is the part most people underestimate. They think a modest lifestyle is static. It's not. Once compounding gains momentum, your freedom expands year after year without you doing anything except not destroying your own progress with unnecessary spending. A lot of people sabotage themselves by chasing returns that are too high or by constantly pulling money out of their investments to keep up with lifestyle inflation. But the combination of a low financial burn rate and a steady 4% real return flips the script. Instead of your lifestyle growing faster than your portfolio grows faster than your lifestyle. That's the moment when financial freedom becomes inevitable instead of theoretical. And remember, the goal here isn't to get rich in the way most people imagine it. The goal is to reach a point where you don't have to work unless you want to. A simple 4% return on a carefully protected $300,000 doesn't make you wealthy in the flashy sense, but it makes you wealthy in the sense that actually matters. It gives you options. It removes the fear of being one paycheck away from crisis. It buys you hours, days, and years that aren't controlled by someone else's schedule. It gives you space to pursue meaningful work rather than necessary work. It's not the kind of wealth that shows up in luxury Instagram posts, but it's the kind of wealth that shows up in peaceful mornings, unhurried afternoons, and a life where pressure is replaced by autonomy. People grow up surrounded by messages that tell them wealth is measured by the size of the house, the brand of the car, the neighborhood they live in, and the things they can buy on command. Everywhere they look, they're surrounded by examples of people constantly upgrading their lives, bigger homes, fancier gadgets, more expensive experiences. It's no surprise, then, that they begin to believe freedom and happiness only come after reaching some enormous financial milestone. They assume independence requires millions of dollars because they base their expectations on lifestyles that are built on constant consumption. The truth is that the number most people think they need for freedom isn't based on reality. It's based on what they see other people doing. They mistake the lifestyle others show for the lifestyle they need, forgetting that most people living those inflated lives are not free at all. They are tied to their income, tied to their image, tied to a cycle of earning and spending that never lets them breathe. When you step back and look at real financial independence, not the flashy version, something becomes clear. Freedom costs far less than most people assume. The gap between what people want and what they actually need is enormous, but it only shrinks once they stop looking at money as a tool for status and start seeing it as a tool for control over their time. Most people overestimate what they need because they underestimate how powerful it is to cut unnecessary expenses, simplify their lifestyle, and build habits that reduce financial pressure instead of increasing it. They imagine that financial freedom means replicating their current lifestyle without working, instead of realizing that true freedom often comes from designing a new lifestyle entirely. Lifestyle inflation is one of the biggest reasons people believe they need millions. Every time their income rises, their expenses follow, sometimes even exceeding their new earnings. They start believing that certain comforts are non-negotiable, even when they didn't have them before. A bigger TV becomes normal, a luxury car becomes reasonable, frequent dining out becomes routine, and suddenly the amount of money required to sustain that lifestyle skyrockets. They confuse comfort with necessity and consumption with happiness, and before long they can't imagine living on less because they become accustomed to more. But this trap is self-imposed, and it has nothing to do with what's required to build a fulfilling life. It's simply a pattern people slip into without realizing they have the power to choose differently. Once someone breaks away from that pattern, the math behind financial freedom becomes shockingly simple. When you reduce your expenses, you reduce the amount of investment income you need to support yourself. When you reduce the amount of income you need, the amount of wealth required to sustain you drops dramatically. And when the number you're trying to reach becomes smaller, it becomes achievable. That's when people begin to understand that $300,000 can, in many cases, be enough to unlock independence. Not because the number itself is extraordinary, but because freedom is more about structure and discipline than it is about sheer financial mass. What keeps most people stuck isn't the impossibility of reaching a certain number. It's the belief that the number must be massive in the first place. Most people also don't realize how much of their spending is driven by stress, habit, or comparison rather than genuine desire. When you're constantly working, constantly tired, and constantly feeling behind, you spend to soothe, you buy because it feels like a reward, you pay for convenience because you don't have time. But when you have control over your time, the impulse to overspend fades. You cook more because you have the space, you walk more because you're not rushing, you entertain yourself with meaningful experiences rather than expensive distractions. Life naturally becomes less costly, not because you're depriving yourself, but because you're no longer trying to escape your own schedule. This is the part of financial independence that most people dismiss because they've never lived it long enough to understand how it changes their priorities. The belief that independence requires millions is really just a belief that your current lifestyle must be preserved at all costs. But freedom isn't about preserving the past, it's about building the future you actually want. And when you strip away everything that doesn't matter, when you design your days intentionally instead of letting culture decide for you, the number you need to stop working forever becomes far smaller than you ever expected. Most people think financial freedom is something that starts at a huge number. They imagine a moment far off in the distance when they finally hit 1 million or 2 million or some other impressive milestone, and only then will life open up. Only then will they be able to breathe, to choose their own schedule, to feel secure. But that mindset keeps them stuck because it pushes freedom so far into the future that it becomes almost unreachable. What most people don't realize is that freedom doesn't start at a number. It starts when your investments, even small ones, cover the essentials of a lean and intentional lifestyle. That's the real turning point. Not the moment you feel rich, not the moment you have an impressive net worth, but the moment your money handles your basic needs without requiring you to grind every day just to survive. When your investments cover that lean baseline, everything about your life changes. The pressure drops, the urgency disappears, you shift out of survival mode and into strategy mode. Suddenly, you have choices. You don't need to quit working entirely to feel free, you just need enough financial cushioning that work becomes optional rather than mandatory. Once you reach that point, the entire way you think about tasks, projects, and income transforms. You're no longer operating from fear, and fear is what traps most people in a cycle of working more to spend more, only to feel even more dependent on that work. When your core expenses are covered by passive income, even if it's a modest amount, you gain a form of freedom that most people with far larger incomes never experience. A doctor making $300,000 a year might still be financially trapped because their lifestyle demands that level of income. Meanwhile, someone with a small portfolio generating just enough to cover basic housing, food, utilities, and a simple lifestyle might wake up every day feeling more free than the high earner who can't afford to stop. That's the paradox. The size of your lifestyle determines the size of your prison or the size of your freedom. Designing a lean, intentional lifestyle doesn't mean stripping away all joy or living like a monk. It means replacing mindless consumption with meaningful choices. It means recognizing what actually matters to you and what you've been spending on just because everyone else does. When your life is designed around your values instead of society's expectations, you don't need as much money to support it. A smaller investment portfolio can provide stability, especially when your spending is aligned with what truly makes you fulfilled. This is why financial independence is far more accessible than people think. They assume they need to replicate their current lifestyle without working, but they never question whether their current lifestyle is even bringing them happiness. Most people never pause long enough to ask themselves what they actually need to feel free. They chase luxury because they assume it's synonymous with success, even though luxury often locks them into deeper commitments, higher costs, and more dependence on income. Freedom, on the other hand, thrives when costs are low and choices are wide. Once your lean lifestyle is funded, you gain the luxury of time. You can choose work that interests you instead of work that exhausts you. You can pursue projects that take months to pay off because you're not desperate for immediate income. You can explore, experiment, learn new skills, and take small risks that would have been impossible under financial pressure. This is the underrated advantage of reaching the point where your essentials are covered. It gives you breathing room, and breathing room is what allows creativity, resilience, and smart decision making. The irony is that once people have this breathing room, they often end up making more money than before, not because they have to, but because they finally have the energy and mental clarity to make better choices. They take opportunities they would have overlooked. They say no to things that drain them. They stop sabotaging their finances with stress spending. Their portfolio grows because they no longer withdraw from it out of panic. Their earnings, if they choose to keep working at all, feel light instead of heavy. This isn't a fantasy. It's a result of shifting the way you define freedom. It's understanding that independence doesn't require replicating a lifestyle inflated by stress, convenience, and comparison. It requires building a lifestyle rooted in intention, one that your investment returns can support without struggle. When you hit that moment when your investments cover your lean baseline, you don't feel trapped anymore. You feel steady, you feel grounded, you feel like the future belongs to you rather than to your expenses, and that is when financial freedom truly begins. When the pressure to earn disappears, something remarkable happens to the way you think and make decisions. Most people don't even realize how much of their daily stress, exhaustion, and anxiety comes from the constant fear of not making enough money. They might have a good job, a decent savings account, or even a comfortable lifestyle, but deep down they feel vulnerable because they know that everything they have depends on their ability to keep earning. That pressure quietly affects every choice they make. It makes them accept jobs they don't enjoy, say yes to opportunities they don't want, and ignore risks that could benefit them. It keeps them in a survival mindset, even if their income seems high on paper. But once that pressure is lifted, even partially the entire way, they interact with money, work, and life transforms in ways they never expected. Imagine having a financial cushion that covers your basic needs. It doesn't have to be extravagant. It just needs to be enough that you're no longer desperate for your next paycheck. That simple shift gives you mental freedom that even many wealthy people never feel. Suddenly, your decisions become clearer. You don't take opportunities out of fear. You take them because they align with your goals. You don't stay in toxic environments because you have no other choice. You leave because you can. You don't cling to the familiar just because you're afraid of instability. You explore because you have stability inside your investments, even if the number seems modest by traditional standards. The absence of financial pressure is one of the most powerful psychological advantages a person can have. When decisions aren't made under stress, they're more rational, more strategic, and more aligned with long-term success. People underestimate how much poor decision-making comes from panic or scarcity thinking. When you're worried about money, everything feels urgent. You can't think years ahead because you're too busy thinking about tomorrow. But when you have breathing room, you naturally start thinking long-term. You become more patient, more observant, and more willing to let time work in your favor instead of constantly trying to rush results. This shift also makes you more aware of opportunities. When your mind is constantly focused on survival, you miss things that aren't immediate. You overlook creative solutions, ignore investments that require patience, and underestimate the power of stepping back to see the bigger picture. But when you're calm, you notice things others miss. You spot patterns, you see possibilities, you're willing to experiment. And the willingness to experiment is what often leads to breakthroughs, whether in investing, building skills, or creating income streams that are far more rewarding than your previous work. Another surprising benefit is that you stop overvaluing big returns and start valuing consistent ones. When you're under pressure, you want fast results, quick wins, and guarantees. That mindset is dangerous because it makes people chase risky strategies, jump into trends they don't understand, and gamble with their financial future. But a calm mind doesn't need excitement. It prefers stability. It prefers steady growth. It prefers protecting what you already have. And that is exactly the mindset that leads to real wealth over time. It's the difference between constantly swinging for home runs and quietly collecting base hits that eventually win the game. Freedom from financial pressure also changes your relationship with work. You might still work, and many people do, but the dynamic shifts. Work becomes something you choose instead of something you're chained to. You start doing work you enjoy rather than work that drains you. You say no to toxic bosses, unsustainable schedules, and environments that don't value you. Because you're not desperate, you negotiate better. You pick opportunities that fit your lifestyle, You gravitate toward roles that challenge and inspire rather than exhaust and disappoint. Your work improves not because you're trying harder, but because the fear is gone. People often talk about financial freedom as if it's about being rich. But the real transformation isn't the money, it's the calm mind that comes from knowing you're safe. It's the confidence that comes from knowing your survival doesn't depend on anyone else. It's the clarity that comes from thinking without fear. And with that clarity, everything you do becomes more effective. You manage your finances better. You invest smarter. You build systems that grow over time. You protect your energy instead of wasting it. You become the kind of person who naturally builds wealth because you're no longer sabotaging yourself with short-term panic. Once you taste what it feels like to make decisions without financial pressure, you realize how powerful that mental shift truly is. You begin to understand that the real value of financial independence isn't luxury or status, it's the ability to think clearly, choose intentionally, and live life from a place of strength instead of fear. And that clarity, more than any dollar amount, is what turns modest investments into long-term freedom. One of the most misunderstood ideas in personal finance is the belief that you need high-risk, high-return investments to build real wealth. People chase big gains, exciting trends, and dramatic market movements because they think that's where the magic happens. But the truth is almost the opposite. The people who end up with long-lasting financial stability are usually not the ones swinging for the fences. They're the ones who protect what they have, keep their strategy simple, and let compounding do the heavy lifting. A small investment base can become surprisingly powerful when you stop trying to gamble with it and instead focus on discipline, patience, and steady growth. Compounding doesn't care how flashy your strategy is. It only cares that you stay consistent and protect your downside. Most people underestimate just how destructive impulsive decision-making can be to their wealth. They jump into investments because of hype, pull out of them because of fear, and constantly react to the market instead of calmly following a plan. Every time they make a rash move, they interrupt compounding. Every time they chase excitement, they risk losing principle. Protecting your investment base isn't just about avoiding catastrophic losses. It's about avoiding the thousands of little financial cuts that add up over time. A year without losses is often more valuable than a year with a huge win followed by a huge loss. The reason is simple. Recovering from losses takes far more energy, time, and growth than people realize. Now, imagine you take that same investment base, let's say $300,000, and you don't chase the newest trend, the highest yield, or the next big thing. Instead, you place it in a structured, diversified approach designed for resilience. You accept that your returns might not be dramatic, but they'll be steady. You avoid the impulse to constantly tweak your portfolio. You don't panic during temporary downturns. You simply let your money do what it was built to do, grow quietly. A modest, stable return year after year may not be glamorous, but it has a way of surprising people over time. Slow and steady becomes powerful and unstoppable when you refuse to interrupt it. People also forget how emotional investing can be. Fear and greed are the enemies of compounding, and most people unknowingly fuel both. They get greedy when they see other people making money quickly, so they throw their own money into strategies they don't understand. Then when the market dips, as it always does, they get scared and pull out. This constant cycle of chasing and fleeing kills long-term growth. The people who win the game are the ones who step outside that emotional roller coaster. Protecting your capital means protecting yourself from your own emotions. It means having a plan that's boring enough to stick with during the highs and comforting enough to stay with during the lows. Discipline doesn't just preserve your wealth, it amplifies it. When you consistently avoid unnecessary risks, you create a stable foundation. And once you have that foundation, compounding becomes predictable. You start stacking wins, not sporadically, but regularly. Even if the returns are modest, 4%, 5%, 6%, they accumulate in ways that shock people who are used to thinking in short time frames. A small return this year becomes a slightly bigger return next year because it's based on a slightly larger principle. That effect builds on itself over and over. It's like giving a snowball a gentle push down a long hill. It doesn't need to be thrown hard. It just needs time and a clear path. The beauty of a calm, disciplined strategy is that it also reduces your stress. You don't feel like you need to constantly monitor the markets. You don't worry about every headline. You don't feel pressured to outperform everyone you know. You simply let your money grow on its own terms. And when you're not stressed about your investments, you make far better decisions in every aspect of your financial life. You stick to your budget, you avoid unnecessary purchases, you build stronger habits. You create a lifestyle that supports long-term wealth. Another overlooked advantage is that stability in your investments allows stability in your mind. When you're not panicking about losing money, you feel more confident in your job, more patient with your goals, and more thoughtful about your choices. You stop viewing every opportunity as a desperate attempt to catch up. Instead, you evaluate each option calmly and logically. That mindset doesn't just protect your money, it helps you build more of it. You become the kind of person who sees opportunities clearly because you're not blinded by fear or rushing to fill financial holes created by reckless decisions. This consistent, calm, protective approach is exactly what turns small investment bases into meaningful long-term wealth, not by being dramatic, not by being risky, not by being lucky, but by being steady, intentional, and patient. That's the true magic of compounding, and it rewards those who respect it rather than those who try to outsmart it. A small investment base doesn't stay small when you treat it with patience, consistency, and discipline. Most people look at a number like $300,000 and see a limit. They see what it can't do rather than what it can become. But wealth doesn't grow because you start with a massive amount of money. It grows because you allow compounding to work, uninterrupted over long periods of time. When you apply steady habits, protect your capital, and resist the urge to constantly change strategy, that modest base begins expanding in ways that feel almost invisible day to day, but unmistakable over the span of years. It doesn't explode overnight. It accumulates quietly, inch by inch, year by year, until one day it becomes something far larger than what you began with. The reason this happens is because compounding is a multiplier of consistency, not of excitement. It rewards stability, patience, and discipline. When someone invests a large lump sum and then constantly tweaks, tinkers, and reacts to the market, they interrupt the compounding process. But when someone invests modestly and holds steady through the noise, compounding accelerates with time. People think big transformations require big money, but more often they require time that is allowed to work without interference. A small portfolio doesn't stay small if you leave it alone, nourish it steadily, and avoid draining it with lifestyle demands. Another reason a modest base becomes powerful is because once you reach a minimal level of financial independence, where your basic needs are partially covered, you start making better choices with your time and energy. You no longer feel rushed. You don't chase every short-term opportunity. You don't panic when income dips. That psychological shift makes your financial decisions sharper. You're able to focus on long-term returns instead of short-term fixes. And ironically, the moment you no longer feel desperate for money is the moment you start seeing opportunities that you missed before. You might pick up a small side project that brings in a few $100 extra a month. You might negotiate better because you don't need to say yes to everything. You might finally have the calmness to invest more consistently. These small boosts compound too, creating more space for your investments to grow. People often think compounding is just about earning interest on money, but it's also about earning interest on smart decisions. A stable mind compounds, a calm lifestyle compounds, fewer financial mistakes compound. Good habits compound. When you're not operating from fear, you naturally stop sabotaging yourself. You don't sell during market dips. You don't overspend to cope with stress. You don't chase risky investments because you're impatient. All of those avoided mistakes add up over time, and the cumulative effect is enormous. A modest investment base benefits from every good decision you make and every bad decision you avoid. Over the years, as your investment grows, even slowly, you start to feel the difference. The returns increase gradually. What used to be $12,000 a year becomes 14, then 16, then 18. It's not magic, it's math applied patiently. A lot of people fail to appreciate just how powerful incremental increases are. Instead of trying to double your money, you simply aim to not lose it and let it grow at a steady pace. Eventually, the portfolio's growth starts to feel effortless because it is no longer dependent on fresh contributions or stressful sacrifices. The investments are doing the heavy lifting, and your job is simply to avoid interrupting the process. You also learn to appreciate the value of stability. Big risks no longer tempt you because you begin to understand how precious consistency is. When you see your investment grow slowly but surely, you become protective of that progress. You stop thinking in terms of months and start thinking in terms of years and even decades. And when you adopt that mindset, your chances of long-term success rise dramatically. Time becomes your ally instead of your enemy. The longer your money is invested, the more powerful compounding becomes. The more patience you have, the more acceleration you experience. Eventually, you reach a point where the investment isn't just a safety net, it's a growth engine. It feeds itself. It grows even when you're not adding much to it. And by that stage, the number you started with feels almost irrelevant compared to the value that compounding has created. This is why people who understand wealth building don't obsess over starting small. They understand that small is temporary. Small is a beginning, not an identity. With consistency, patience, and the power of compounding working quietly in the background, a modest investment can evolve into a life-changing financial foundation. This expansion doesn't happen through luck or massive earnings. It happens because you respected the process. You allowed time to do what time does best. You protected your capital, stayed disciplined, and resisted the urge to chase quick wins. And by doing so, you created a financial engine that grows naturally, steadily, and exponentially as the years go by. One of the biggest shifts that happens once your basic expenses are covered by your investments is that your whole relationship with work begins to change. Before that point, work is something you need for survival. It's the oxygen tank you can't disconnect from without suffocating. Every decision, every project, every hour of your day is shaped by the pressure to earn. You say yes to things you don't want to do. You tolerate environments that drain you. You choose security over growth because you can't afford to take chances. But once your baseline is funded, once you know that your essentials are covered, the emotional weight that work carries starts to dissolve. You begin to feel a lightness that most people never experience because your life is no longer controlled by the fear of not being able to pay your bills. And when that fear disappears, your ability to think clearly finally emerges. Your decisions become sharper. You're no longer reacting to life. You're designing it. You can choose work that excites you, that aligns with your curiosity, that enriches your mind rather than depleting your energy. Even if that work pays less than your previous job, it doesn't matter as much because you don't need it to survive. You can experiment without panic. You can explore without guilt. You can pursue ideas that take time to develop because you're not counting every hour against the fear of running out of money. This freedom to choose your work is one of the most underestimated forms of wealth. When you're free from the pressure to earn, you start noticing what you're naturally drawn to. You discover passions that your old schedule never left space for. You revisit interests you once shelved because they didn't seem practical or profitable. Interestingly, many people find that the work they do from a place of curiosity ends up being far more profitable in the long run than the work they did purely for money. When your mind is relaxed, you produce better results. When you're not stressed, you solve problems faster. When you're not desperate, you negotiate confidently. And when you enjoy what you're doing, you do more of it without even realizing it, which inevitably leads to improvement and opportunity. This is the irony. Financial independence doesn't just give you freedom from work, it often leads to better work. Another powerful transformation is that you begin to understand your true value. When you're desperate for income, you underestimate yourself. You settle for lower pay, for unhealthy environments, for unreasonable demands because you don't feel like you have a choice. But once you reach a point where you don't need every paycheck to survive, your sense of worth shifts. You're not afraid to walk away from something that feels wrong. You're not afraid to say no to an offer that undervalues your time. You're not afraid to take your skills somewhere they're appreciated. That confidence alone can double your opportunities because people instinctively trust someone who is not acting out of fear. You also start to see time differently. When work is optional instead of mandatory, the hours of your day regain their meaning. You no longer trade time for money by default. You trade time for growth, for creativity, for rest, for exploration. You start questioning what you actually want to do instead of what you feel obligated to do. Maybe you shift to part-time work. Maybe you take seasonal jobs. Maybe you start consulting, freelancing, or building a small business not because you have to, but because you want to create something that matters to you. Work becomes a tool, not a chain. This shift also improves your relationships. When you're not exhausted from working out of necessity, you show up differently for the people around you. You have more energy, more patience, more attention. You can invest in your friendships, spend time with your family, or pursue hobbies that make you feel alive. This creates a healthier, more balanced life where work is just one part of your identity, not the entire foundation of it. And perhaps the most surprising part is that once work becomes a choice, many people end up working more, not because they're forced to, but because they're genuinely interested in what they're doing. When you remove the chains of obligation, creativity flows, curiosity blooms. You start projects you've been putting off for years, you take on challenges that feel exciting instead of stressful. And even if those projects don't make money immediately, they enrich your life in a way that paid work never could. Once your financial baseline is covered, work stops being a burden and becomes an expression of who you are. It becomes something you craft intentionally rather than something you endure. And that is one of the greatest rewards of early financial independence. Not the money itself, not the number in the investment account, but the ability to wake up each day knowing you get to choose what kind of work you do, how much you do, and why you do it. When you finally reach a point where your basic needs are covered, where your investments quietly take care of the essentials, you don't wake up one morning feeling like a completely different person. Instead, something subtle yet powerful begins to shift inside you. Life becomes calmer. Your decisions become sharper. The constant background noise of financial anxiety fades, and in its place grows a sense of inner steadiness you may have never experienced before. That feeling of stability becomes the real reward. Not luxury, not status, not some grand display of wealth, just the quiet assurance that tomorrow is handled. That's what $300,000 invested wisely and paired with a lean lifestyle can give you long before you ever feel rich in the traditional sense. The first thing most people notice is the mental clarity that comes from no longer needing to hustle for survival. You stop making decisions from panic and you start making them from intention. That shift changes the entire trajectory of a life. You no longer feel the need to chase every opportunity or cling to every paycheck. Instead, you step back and evaluate what actually matters. That ability to slow down even slightly is a privilege that money rarely gets credit for. People think wealth is about buying things, but its true value lies in removing fear from your decision making. With stability comes better choices. You start opting for sustainability over urgency, You don't jump at get-rich-quick schemes anymore because you don't need them. You don't risk your future to solve today's problems. You begin to appreciate the beauty of steady compounding. You play the long game because now you finally have the patience to do so. Even your spending habits shift naturally. You're not depriving yourself. You're simply no longer trying to fill emotional gaps with purchases. You spend with clarity rather than impulse, and that alone can change your financial future as dramatically as any investment return. What's interesting is how this inner peace changes your outlook on time. When money pressures fade, time becomes more valuable, not less. You start noticing how much of your life was previously spent in stress, rushing, or distraction. Suddenly you become protective of your days. You want to use them well. You want to give them to things that genuinely matter rather than obligations that once felt unavoidable. This is when people start rediscovering things they lost touch with. Curiosity, creativity, learning, rest, even boredom becomes a sign of freedom instead of a luxury you can't afford. Because your basics are covered, you're finally able to think in terms of meaning instead of survival. You start asking deeper questions. What kind of life do I actually want? What makes me feel alive? What kind of work feels like an expression instead of a burden? These questions don't come from luxury, they come from stability. And the answers often lead people to a more intentional life than any amount of income could have given them when they were stressed. Another surprising thing that happens is that your definition of enough starts to change. When your survival isn't on the line anymore, you begin to realize how little you actually need to be content. Simplicity stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like freedom. This is when financial independence becomes sustainable, not because you have the most money, but because your expectations align with your values rather than with society's pressure to constantly want more. You stop moving the goalpost, you stop living in comparison, and you start genuinely appreciating the wealth you already have, no matter its size. As life stabilizes, your relationships improve too. When you're no longer drained by stress, you're more present with the people you care about, you communicate better, you listen more deeply, you have time and emotional space to nurture connections instead of just managing them. Stability doesn't just benefit your wallet, it reshapes the quality of your interactions and the depth of your relationships. It makes you more grounded, more patient, more generous. And perhaps the most important transformation is how you see the future. Instead of imagining it as a series of unknown threats you must prepare for, you start seeing it as a landscape of possibilities. You're no longer bracing yourself for impact, you're planning, dreaming, thinking. You start building things that take years instead of days. You invest in yourself, in your skills, in your health, in your relationships, in your future self, because now it feels worth investing in. The future no longer feels like something that's happening to you. It feels like something you're shaping. This is the real power of reaching that point where work becomes optional and your foundations are secure. Not the number itself, not the bragging rights, not the outward signs of wealth. It's the steadiness in your voice, the calm in your decisions, the confidence in your steps. It's the ability to breathe deeply. It's the freedom to choose how you live, not just how you earn. It's the quiet but life-changing realization that you are safe, you are stable, and you finally have the space to build the life you actually want.